Well, good morning. It's good to see you this morning. I hope that you have been well. I know we have about a dozen or so people worshiping at the very last Belmont Church of Christ meeting this morning. We're wishing them well. In fact, I bring it up to mention that, man, we should be extremely grateful for the decades of ministry that Belmont has put in our community and in bad things about them, all right? People don't like that. Because of that, many of the prophets, they were beaten, they were chased out of town, they were actually killed for what they did. But on top of that, one of the hardest things about being a prophet was God. Because he would ask you to do some pretty ridiculous stuff. He asked the prophets a lot of times to act out kind of a parable, to act out a parable of how Israel and him related. He wanted them to live out the way that him and his people related. And as we know, God's people were not usually on very good terms with God, okay? And so sometimes being a prophet for God meant you were doing some things that were not very fun, were not very comfortable. And it's this kind of lived out parable that I want us to look at in Hosea. So let's just start with Hosea chapter 1. I'm going to skip verse 1 so I don't have to read the names. But starting in verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So we're going to stop right there, and we're going to ask the question that you're all thinking. Did God just ask his prophet to marry a prostitute? And yes, he did, okay? And that is absolutely crazy for us, right? That is surprising. It's different. Don't worry. Our kids are in Kingdom Kids this week because this is officially a PG-13 kind of sermon. It doesn't think of as God. We don't think it's God's will for his people to go and marry a prostitute. Now, if you've never heard this sermon before, you probably look a little bit like this, right? I see that out in the crowd. You're just like, what? What in the world is happening here? You can just kind of imagine Hosea as a modern-day preacher trying to get a job, sitting down with the elders and them saying, you know what, Hosea, you seem like a good guy. You seem to know the Lord very well. Tell us a little bit about your family. And he's like, well, wife's a prostitute, sleeps around on me all the time, but God told me to do it, so it's okay. The elders, right? You're not getting that job. You're not getting that job. It's not what we think of as biblical material. But we got to remember that God had a purpose with all of this. He had his prophets who live out these real life parables to teach the people. And this was one of them. It's not even one of the more ridiculous ones. You ought to read Ezekiel and Isaiah. Hosea, he married an unfaithful, promiscuous woman because Israel was an unfaithful people cheating on God, the one true God, with all sorts of idols. And so Hosea's life, it becomes this living sermon. Instead of God saying, hey, my people are like an adulterous wife, he tells Hosea, you go marry an adulterous wife and show the people around you what that's like, what this looks like, how I feel, because I want them to see it. It's one thing to hear it, right? You hear stuff from me all the time. It's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to see it. And when the Israelites, when the people around Hosea, when they saw his wife being unfaithful, you can imagine the kind of things they thought to themselves, right? Or maybe even said out loud, saying things like, why is she doing that? Why isn't she faithful to her husband? Doesn't she know he's a prophet? Such an honorable man? He's so much more than she deserves. Like, he should kick her to the curb. And as they thought these things, and as they watched this stuff firsthand, you can imagine that in those moments, Hosea's message was clear. Why are you being unfaithful to God? God himself is so much more than you deserve. Maybe God should kick you to the curb because of your unfaithfulness, right? You can see that message playing out for a people in rebellion, for a people who are living a adulterous lifestyle within their faith. That's a powerful message. But God's metaphor, it doesn't just end with telling him to go marry an adulterous wife, promiscuous wife. It carries on. And so this is where we read in verse 3 through 5. Well, one second, I want to point out this. Last week, you remember me telling you about growing up in my Kingdom Kids and hearing the way in which they helped us remember the books of the Bible. So I told you last week with Joel, they had a bowl of Jell-O, and Locust reading the Jell-O to show us that Jell-O. That's how we learned the book of the Bible. This is how I learned Hosea. It is a prostitute made out of a garden hose. Don't worry, we have much better material for your children here than I grew up with. In verse 3, just to get the other picture out of the way. So he married Gomer, not the one you're thinking of, different Gomer. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diablam, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. And that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. So Jezreel was a spot of actually quite a few brutal murders by Israelite kings. And while the text isn't specific on which murder or massacre he's talking about, regardless, it shows us that God will be avenging wrongdoing. It shows us that he doesn't forget and that he will bring justice to hurting. Now, many people at this point, by the time Hosea comes around in the late 17th century or 700s BC, many people probably thought that God had forgotten about all those murders, that those evildoers were not going to be brought to justice. But with this name, with this message, and Hosea as a public prophet, everybody would have gotten this message. With this name, God is reminding everyone that what is right still wins out. And look, I'm not going to focus on this specific message too much today. It's not our main point. But I do hope it encourages us that when we look around in our world today and we see wrongdoing and we see corruption and we see oppression, we see the little guy being trampled on, when we witness that, as we do every day, I hope that just this little tiny bit reminds us that we can trust that God hasn't forgotten about it. He won't forget about it. And that eventually he will right the scales and bring balance from wrongdoing, okay? That we gotta hold on to that. if we move forward. That's not our message today, but it's there. It's regularly through the Bible. So, and then the next bit we get in verse 6 and 7, it said, Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. This is a little different. There's a tiny little detail. Look back at verse 3, or verse 4. No, verse 3. She conceived and bore him a son. Verse 6, Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. What's different? No him. Yeah, that's right. That possessive is gone. I think, and a lot of other people think, that is a very intentional decision by the author to not bring Hosea into it because it's not his kid. Okay? To me, it's a pretty intentional decision by the author to show that this baby was not Hosea's. All right? That's kind of the story here, that she was a promiscuous woman living out into the world. And so, verse 6, Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. For I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them. Now this name kind of has a twofold meaning, right? One, for the daughter, for the actual daughter herself. Because of her mother's adultery, she will never be able to enjoy that true love of her father. Now, I'm sure Hosea is going to be there, and Hosea is going to love that little girl, but she will never experience the love of her true father because of the sin that her mother committed. And then as we reflect on that, the bigger picture, number 2, is that because of Israel's adultery, they had strayed, and now they would no longer be enjoying the love of their heavenly Father, right? Because of Israel's adultery, they would no longer receive the love of their heavenly Father. And because of that specific situation, the same thing was happening. Do you kind of see that dual meaning there? And it happens again in verses 8 and 9. After she'd weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Once again, don't see Hosea, that's a part of that. Then the Lord said, call him Lo Ami, which means not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Another child not born from Hosea, and another name with a dual meaning. In all reality, this son was not Hosea's people, right? It was not his people. He was born in this house with his name, but it was not his child. And in the same way, Israel's adultery had alienated them from being God's people. If you read back to that background sheet, if you remember back what we said in Amos, Israel's going to be completely conquered, destroyed, and exiled by the Assyrian Empire before long, right? They were being cast off. They were suffering. They would be hurt. And we look at this, the Hosea situation with the adulterous wife. We look at the kids born out of wedlock. We look at the names they receive. This is a pretty sad story. I know I started off with a little bit of humor, but this is a pretty sad story. It's easy for us to start feeling bad for Hosea. His wife, who he loves, and I do think he loves her, by the way. It wouldn't be a very good analogy for God's relationship to Israel if Hosea did not have true, genuine love for Gomer. Okay? But this wife that he loves is continually cheating on him. The kids, which mostly aren't even his, have these super depressing names that declares to everyone their illegitimacy just by introducing themselves. I mean, you just can imagine the pain here. Can you imagine the stares that Hosea got as he went about his business every day? Or the nights that alone they spent wondering where his wife was? Or how the kids were teased because of their names and the life that they were born into? It's a pretty awful story when we get down and let it come to life. We talked about that, Jim did in our class this morning, when we let just the black and white words come to life and actually see how it's lived out. That's an incredibly painful life, incredibly painful story. And it's tempting to take this story and to look at the sad situation and then to make God out to be the bad guy, right? I mean, I think that's a very easy thing to do here, to look at what has happened and wonder, why would God set up this husband and wife when he knows it would bring so much pain? Why would God ask for that if he knows it's going to hurt? Why would God require these innocent children to bear witness to such horrible things with their names? But I think if we can take a step back for a moment and see the bigger picture, it's so easy to focus in too tightly on Hosea and his story and forget that life, that those events were meant to reflect and share a bigger thing, right? That it was representing the reality that God was living with his people. Yes, it is a painful story for Hosea, for his wife, for his children. But it's an illustration for a larger community of the suffering that God felt as a spurned husband and people who were rejecting him on a daily basis. I taught Hosea to our youth group back when I was doing youth ministry here, and I was going back through my notes for this sermon, and I had written down a note from Isaac back when he was in the youth group. You're a college grad now, so it's been a little while, but he said, well, you have to remember that this is just a small example of the pain and the suffering that God is feeling. As we were kind of having this discussion and talking about, man, how horrible is this? Why would God do this? As a teenager, brought up, well, don't forget, this is just a microcosm of the amount of suffering and pain that God is feeling in his limitless way. Yeah, Hosea's story is sad, but it's just a small mirroring of the pain that God is feeling. We got to take a moment to see God as a real being. Not as some, ethereal power, not as some old man in the sky, but no, God is a true individual who has thoughts, who has feelings, who has a genuine relationship with you and his people and the Israelites. To see him as a broken-hearted husband whose wife has spurned him and gone astray. Not just once, but over and over and over again for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think that the people of God, they could look and they could see the pain in the face of Hosea. They could see that. But I think it would have been so much stronger, it would have hurt so much more to see it actually in the face of God. That specific example was just a little bit that we should focus on and then expand to understand how God felt. Because with God, his people, they're not even just the bride, right? We talk about the church as the bride of Christ. But also in a way, God created each and every one of us, right? He designed us. He knit us together in our mother's womb. And so there's a way, it's also like a father who's being abandoned by his children. There's kind of dual metaphors here that we can run with. The husband and the wife and the father with the children. And both are equally heartbreaking, right? He loves them. He loves us before we were born. He knows everything about us. And then in life, when he tries to guide us and provide for us like a father or a husband, he just is left alone, cheated on, and abandoned. And to me, that's a much sadder story than the temporary pain of Hosea. It's real, and it's supposed to be real. It wouldn't have been an effective, lived-out parable if it wasn't real. But the pain of Hosea's situation, it's meant to teach us about the pain of God. Now, in chapter 2, we kind of get this long poetry from God about how his people have forsaken him like an adulterous spouse. He kind of elaborates on it. But I just want to pull out 2 quick verses from chapter 2, verse 5 and verse 8. God says, their mother has been unfaithful, and she has conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her silver and gold. How often do we go out into the world looking for the things that we know only God provides? Think about that. How often do we find ourselves turning to the world to find the things that we know that only God provides? We want love, so we turn to sex. We want happiness, so we turn to drugs. We want peace, so we turn to the bottle. And oftentimes, it's not even that dramatic. We gossip because we want to feel better about ourselves. We work harder to make more money because we want to feel safer. We invest in political leaders because we want to feel like we have more power, right? We constantly look out to the world and say, I'm going to go get my stuff from the world because I need this, I need this, I need this. Well, God says, no, that's only going to come from me. And not all these things that I've mentioned, they're not inherently bad. The question is, where are you looking to find satisfaction in your life? Where are you turning to be satisfied in your life? Are you looking to God, or are you looking to idols? The worldly things are going to fail us every single time. They will always fall short. But God never does. God never will. Even when his people turn away from him, God, he still provides for them, right? That's verse 8 here. He's saying, hey, even when they were in rebellion, even when they were running after other lovers, I was still giving them these things. And then they turn and they give them back to Baal. But I was still providing for them. That's the loving heart of our God, providing for us even in rebellion. However, as wonderful as that truth may be, when we turn our backs on God, hardships is going to come. That's just how it works. Not because God is always necessarily punishing us, though sometimes I think he does. But also, when we turn our backs on God, we're just going to get into trouble. Because he wants good things for us, and when we walk away from that, we're going to find ourselves in bad spots. We separate ourselves from God, and we make ourselves vulnerable to the many dangers of the world. Look back to Hosea's example, and if you've read this, you might know this. His wife, she continues to leave him, to cheat on him, and she gets to a point where she is completely separated from Hosea. Not by Hosea's choice, per se, but she has left him, and she is gone at this point. And in that separation, without Hosea's love, without his protection, without his guidance, do you know what happens to Gomer? She falls into slavery. She falls into slavery. And I think that is such an accurate picture of what happens to us when we walk away from God. When we choose to chase after other lovers and other idols and turn our back on God till we are completely cut off from him, what's going to happen to us? We're going to become captive to something, right? Something that does not want good for us. That's what I think it does. It doesn't take long for us to fall back into being a slave to sin in this fallen world. But here's kind of the thing I want to get at this morning. That's not our message, okay? That's not the sermon that I want to preach to you this morning. That we are spiritual adulterers, that we have cheated on God regardless of what he has done for us, that we experience pain and suffering when we come apart from him. That's not the message. Those are the facts, okay? Those are the facts, and that's an important foundation. But that's not the message. The message is that God is the definition of love. God is the definition of a perfect, graceful, loving husband. And that regardless of sin, regardless of what we've done, he still loves us. And he will do whatever it takes to bring us back into his arms. And just to read the ending of chapter 2 as he's described how they've run away from him, he ends it by saying, "In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down safely. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice and love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain and the new wine and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one." Right? Lo Ruhamai, remember the name of the daughter? I will say to those called not my people, Lo Ami, remember the name of the kid? You are my people. And they will say, you are my God. God wants to have a relationship with us so badly. His desire is to see his creation, his loved ones, reunited with him. That's what he wants. And I look at this and I'm like, how do we resist this kind of love? One, I don't think we can very well. I think it's a battle for us to resist the grace of God. It is so beautiful. It is so unexplainable. We literally have a hard time understanding this, especially in this illustration, right? Because do you have any friends that would tell you to go back to your spouse after they cheated on you time and time and time again, had kids with different people and different people? How many of your friends would say, oh, go back to him, it's okay? None. They probably wouldn't be a great friend if they were, right? But I mean, that's the grace and the love and the heart of God, a God who will chase you down over and over again, regardless of how many times you walk away. It's hard to understand that. But I'll tell you what, if it's an option, I'm going to take it, right? If that's an option, I'm going to take it because I screw up all the time. If God is going to continue to love me, no matter how many times I walk away from God, or I spurn God, or I go after other spiritual lovers in faith, well, I don't have words to describe how thankful that makes me, right? That is life-changing. It's hard to see the world. When that truly sinks in, it's hard to see the world the same way again. And it kills me that there are so many people out there who think to themselves, no, I've gone too far. No, I've done too many bad things. I've crossed the last line. I can't come back to God again. That is ridiculous, if I can be rude to you. Okay? That is ridiculous. I've said this before. Who do you think you are that you can out-sin the grace and love of God? I've said that before. Who do you think you are that you can out-sin the grace of God. You're not that good. You're not that strong. You're not that bad. You're not powerful enough for that. This is the greatest love of all time, and it's flowing freely, so freely to each and every one of us. When it comes to God, his love, his grace, his forgiveness, that's what comes first. Not the judgment, not the punishment. His love, his grace, his forgiveness, that's what comes first. And the Hosea story, it reflects that as well. And we're only getting 3 chapters into a 14-chapter book today. And we're moving on after this. But just look at how the illustration ends in chapter 3. The Lord said to me, go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes, which is an interesting image, but that's kind of a pagan worship item. So I bought her, because she was in slavery. I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way towards you. Regardless of all the pain his wife had caused him, Hosea, he takes her back, and he loved her like the first time, because that's what God taught him that love looks like. Because if he's going to live out a parable, that's how God responds to us. In fact, the money and the goods listed there that he used to buy her out of slavery to redeem his wife, that was worth a lot. That's no little cost. In fact, I read some stuff that said it was probably, there's no way anybody was asking for that much. Like, it was probably offered way above price. But he was willing to pay it so that the one he loved could be free. Sound familiar? What a beautiful example of love and forgiveness. See, the story of Hosea, as we close, the story of Hosea, it's the story of a man who gave himself to a rebellious individual, who was rejected and hurt by the one he loved, who decided to pay a great price to redeem them out of slavery, and who welcomed them back into their loving arms in a safe home. That's the story of Hosea. If we can help you in any way this morning, if maybe it's time that you decide you're not running away from God anymore, that you want to be welcomed back, we would love to invite you to go into the waters of baptism this morning. And we invite you to do that now as we stand and as we sing.